Next up.
All right, our second presentation is titled Understanding School Levies. Mrs. Lane and I will be leading that presentation. Give some of our audience members a few minutes to exit. Not that you can't stay and enjoy this riveting presentation. So we'll start similar to last week with purpose of the presentation. So this is the second part of a two-part presentation. At our February 16th meeting, we had part one. During that part of the presentation, we talked about some cost-cutting measures that we will be initiating in an attempt to reduce the size of a levy that is looming. This evening, our goal is to educate the board and the community about the different kinds of levies that exist. In addition, we want to provide the board with an opportunity to ask questions, have discussions, and provide feedback. What happens next? Our leadership team will continue to explore options regarding additional cost-cutting measures. In fact, at our next meeting on March 16th, we will be giving an update, sharing those additional measures, as well as the savings associated with those options. Again, we are looking forward to any feedback the board may have as we move forward in the process. The feedback from the board and the financial outlook after we finalize some cost-cutting measures will assist us as we get closer to making a recommendation to the board. Up next, how are school districts financed? In Ohio, they are financed with a combination of federal, state, and local funds. For this year, the district is receiving 64% of its funding at the local level, 29% at the state level, and 7% at the federal level. It should be noted that the federal level of funding is at 7% this year, mainly because of ESSER funding, which will be going away. The federal percentage is usually around 2%, which pushes up the local percentage. At the state level, school districts receive funding from the Ohio Department of Education's general revenue funds and Ohio lottery profits. At the local level, school districts receive funding from locally levied property taxes. In addition, there are some school districts who receive funding from income taxes approved by voters. What is a property tax levy? Simply put, it's the collection of taxes charged on the value of property. Each school district must follow a process described in Ohio law in order for taxes to be levied on property within the district. First part of that process is for a Board of Education to propose additional local tax revenues by board resolution. If a majority of the voters in an election approve the tax, county officials charge and collect the tax, and the collected funds are then dispersed to the school district. This time, I'll turn it over to Mrs. Lane so she can talk about the types of property that can be taxed.
Thank you, Billy. So what type of property can be taxed? It's basically two different classifications. Class 1 is for our residential and agricultural properties. Class 2 is for our commercial, industrial, and all other real property. So for the Fairfield City School District, about 70% of our tax base is in Class 1 and 30% is in Class 2. Types of levies, basically the way I think about it is three different buckets. So we have operating levies, which are mainly for day-to-day expenses. We have permanent improvement levies that are used, monies that are used to basically do maintenance, repairs, anything that has a useful life of 5 years or more. And then the third bucket is for bond issues or bond levies. Those are for school construction. As of right now, we have all three types of levies on our books here in Fairfield. So what type of levy are we looking at for the future? Again, for us, we need the day-to-day expenses covered. So there are several different types of operating levies. And the three most popular are listed there on the slide. Continuing levies are assessed indefinitely. They are subject to a reduction factor, which we're going to get to here in just a minute to explain what exactly that means. Second type of levy is a limited type. That is usually approved for 1 to 5 years. Again, it can be renewed or replaced at the expiration, and it is subject to that reduction factor. The one type of operating levy that isn't associated with that reduction factor is called an emergency levy, and that's usually for a fixed dollar amount. Again, it's usually approved for 1 to 5 years, and it can be renewed at expiration. So a continuing levy for our district, that is all of our current operating levies that are on the books are continuing. So I just wanted to point that out to you. So one decision that we have to make, so once we make the decision to go to the ballot, the amount that's needed is usually expressed in mills. So what is a mill? A mill is the value for expressing the rate of property taxes in Ohio. Millage is applied to only 35% of a home's value. So that 35% is referred to as the assessed value, or you may hear assessed valuation. A mill equals 1/10%, or 1/10 of a cent. So for every $1,000 in assessed value, a mill produces $1. So for us, 1 mill in the Fairfield City School District generates approximately $1.8 million. Okay, so I talked about that reduction factor in a prior slide. So what is that? What does that mean? Sometimes it's referred to as House Bill 920. And House Bill 920 was passed in 1976, basically to prevent inflation from increasing taxes. And I won't read every single sentence on there, but the amount of the millage that's collected at the time when the levy is passed, the amount of taxes that are collected, cannot increase over the life of that levy. So basically, as inflation hits, you still pay the same amount of property taxes, or we collect the same amount of property taxes as we did when the levy first passed. So for instance, if we pass a levy this year, and next year if it happens to be a reappraisal year, so property values increase, doesn't mean we collect more taxes. Because again, that House Bill 920 puts a reduction factor on the millage to roll it back to keep it steady, so we collect the same amount. So our collections, our revenue does not increase as property values increase. So that's why we have to keep going back to our community for another levy. People often ask, well, is there anything besides a property tax levy that you can use to collect revenue? And as Billy mentioned a few minutes ago, there is another option. It's called a school district income tax. It can be either on earned income or unearned income. It only applies to the residents of the district. So our corporations, our businesses don't pay any of this tax. It does take 18 months for us to realize a full collection. And again, it's not subject to the reduction factor because it's not a property tax levy, it's an income tax. There are 4 districts currently in Butler County that have a school district income tax, and the percentages that they have on their books are between 0.5% and 1.25%. So I'm going to go back and show you this slide again because I wanted to remind our public that we have not been on the ballot for an operating levy since November of 2011. So that's it's over 11 years. That's a long time for a school district not to have an operating levy, thank goodness. But it's time now that we have to seriously look at raising additional funds. So we have some deadlines. If we decide to move forward, there's 2 different opportunities remaining for this calendar year. And those are the deadlines for those, to put those on the ballot. I will turn it back over to Billy to wrap up.
Yeah, so again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are in the early stages of this conversation. Just to recap, we talked about some cost-cutting measures at our last meeting. The idea is to identify as many cost-cutting measures as we can so that we can minimize the size of a levy once we decide to go on the ballot. We are also continuing to have more conversations moving forward about how we can save additional monies. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be coming back to you on March 16th to share some of those additional items that we've been exploring since our last meeting. I also anticipate we've had meetings with our administrators and shared with them that this is we will continue to live in this space of looking for opportunities to save money indefinitely. Again, to highlight, just to review some of the things we talked about, is constantly looking at positions when someone resigns or retires. Do we have an opportunity to reduce our staffing through attrition? And I think Nancy pointed out during our last meeting, 77% can be tied back to salaries and benefits. But again, education is a very labor-intensive profession. That makes sense. And anytime we reduce staffing, then we are also reducing supports and services that we provide to our students and our families. So very tough conversations, but we will continue to have those. Again, we would welcome any feedback that you might have this evening as we move forward through this process.
Yeah, thoughts, questions?
I appreciate the continued work that you guys do. I'm sure this is not an easy task, and to kind of be in it every day. I appreciate you guys' continued work on that. Thank you, Nancy, for explaining more about how levies work. I now feel a little bit more educated about what a millage is and what a mill means, because I always just assumed it was a million, and now I feel way more informed. So thank you so much. And I know this is not an easy subject for anybody, but I'm just super glad that we have the opportunity to do it now instead of not having anything.
Yeah, really building on that point, I appreciate you explaining it as you did, and I think it's very informative for the public. I think that's an easy place to rationalize voting no. Well, I don't really understand it. I pay enough in taxes. I don't want to do this, right? But I think faced with the realities of what we're talking about and laying out a very factual case that we haven't had a levy since 2011, and now we're in reduction mode, and there's not a whole lot of low-hanging fruit, right? So these are tough decisions we're making right now, and we'll continue to make, as you said.
Thank you so much for the information. It is very important, particularly at this time that we look at some of these terms. So phantom revenue, that I think is really, really important because there are discussions right now. I've seen some of the discussions in social media because property valuation has been realized. People seem to believe that the schools benefit from that valuation. And I think it's important to dispel myths around that. I think it's critical that, citizens understand that your tax bills go up because we have really had such an increase in valuation, which is now starting to come down a little bit. But they definitely need to understand that there was not something that the school district did, and we don't benefit from that. That we are still we're a cap district, and those types of conversations are important to have, as conversations have already started in the public. So misconceptions that can lead to poor performance possibly. We have to clear those things up.
That might be another topic for a public discussion, quite honestly, right?
Hopefully.
A lot of people talk about, oh, look how much gambling money there is. Well, that's a bit of a misnomer too, isn't it? So,
It really is.
let's keep that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could be another discussion as we get closer.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I also want, sorry, my voice is still not back to where it should be, but I also want to thank you for the explanation of a mill, because it seems very simple now when I'm thinking about it, and before I could not wrap my head around how you calculate a mill. But where you said that a mill equals 1/10% or 1/10 of a cent for every $1,000 in assessed value, a mill produces $1. So you're saying for every $1,000 the tax is $1 for every $1,000 of valuation?
So let me just give you an example. So on a $100,000 value, so if you have a $100,000 value of a house, 35% of that is what's taxed.
Yeah.
Right? So basically, it's $35 per that $100,000 home,
Okay.
because they only tax 35% of your value. So I like to look at it in those terms to make it a little more understandable,
Yeah.
because that way, you know, if you have a home that's valued at $200,000, you just double it.
Yeah.
For 1 mil, so that's
1 mil.
easy.
if
That's
you do
actually
it-
where I
For
was
me.
going with it, because I had done calculations, like, well, if your house was worth, you know, 200,000, and the assessed value is 35% of that, which, so you'd be $70. So when we're talking about mills and stuff, it's not like,
Right.
in most cases, we're not saying, oh, you're gonna have $1,000 higher bill, you know, we're talking about,
Right, it's based on your value.
yeah, we're talking about, you know, $35 per
Per
100,000.
$100,000,
So it's,
yes.
yeah, we're not,
For each
we wouldn't be
mill.
trying to, you know, rake homeowners over
No.
And at
over
this
the
point,
coals
we-
or anything.
We don't know where we're at with
No.
a millage, right?
Not yet.
Do we have any sort of, I guess, ballpark idea what, if there would be a financial benefit to the income tax versus the real estate levy? I mean, to me, I don't
I don't
think.
know that yet.
Income tax doesn't seem like it would be very helpful to me. I mean, I've,
It's more volatile.
Yeah.
Right, because it's based on your income.
and,
It also takes a lot longer to make that collection,
18
Yeah.
months.
18 months. So, I mean, there are pros and cons to it. I'm not going to say one way or the other. It's just, I personally think it would be hard for our district to pass that type of levy, because we're used to the continuing property tax levies that have
Yeah.
always passed. I mean, not always, after a few tries sometimes, but those are the ones we have them, that's what people are used to.
yeah.
And income tax can be, again, sometimes it's hard to predict. And some of our districts have unfortunately experienced that with the pandemic and lately with I mean, you just never know. So like I said, there's pros and cons to each of those types of levies that are presented.
I would imagine that most taxpayers would probably prefer the $35 per, you know, 100,000 valuation to an income tax, which is another headache, because you have to fill out a separate income tax form and all that.
Well,
too,
and
so-
just remember that businesses aren't paying any of
Yeah.
that. That's all on the residents. So that's the other piece.
I have a question. Scott, do you have a?
Yeah, just reiterate that simple example, I think is the best way to roll it out, is per 100,000, it's $35.
Per mill.
Yeah, it's the elementary that way. Appreciate the transparency again of everything on the spending, and again, I want the community to know that we are involved in the conversations over the years, not just during this time. The team looks at, cuts at. Mr. Perry has taken a fine-tooth comb to his side of it, and that's a large part of it. It's a give and take. I think we've I don't want to say sacrificed, I think we've managed well with cutting back on the spending of buses that we used to. We navigated that differently, which helps. We stretch it out to 11 years, that's uncanny. So congratulations and thank you for doing that. I would also just let the community know that when you see some new items, new builds, new functions, please, to Ms. Shorter's point, let's make sure that we're clear on our understanding of where that's coming from. A couple examples is the batting cages, the healthy snacks for the athletes. That is not school money. That was donated, that was fundraised outside of the school funds. So when you see something that's new or being built, please don't go to social media and blast it. If that's, you know, let's have conversations. Let's talk through what the reality is of the spending, because we're very good at what we do. I think we're very good in Ohio as far as a district overall and how we spend money. The last thing I want to do is cut staffing for the students. I don't want any of the teachers to have any more overload than what they have. Teaching's hard. And the students are going through a lot. I've visited several schools this year. I've talked to some subs. Students are going through a lot, which means that teachers go through a lot. And we need teachers. And we need less students per teacher. And nobody likes to pay more taxes, but the $35 per 100,000 is an easy way to say this may make sense. So please, if you have questions, write them down, think about them, and let's talk about it. Let's not just, go off the deep end because the school wants more money. There's a lot that goes into what we do with our money for these kids, for the teachers, and for the community. We're very wise with what we do. I believe personally, I've looked into it a lot here in the last few months. But we're an open book. So community, please ask questions. Ms. Shorter?
Thank you. I just had a question. There's a lot of talk in the state house about a possible flat tax. Have you looked at the impact of that? Because that would pertain to our state share, that 30% that goes into.
So I was on a webinar for an hour and a half today.
Okay.
All right. And there's a lot of things out there, not just that. And honestly, no, I have not had a chance yet to look at how each of those impact. There are going to be some simulations out there, but honestly, it's hard to keep up with everything they have in that bill and what they're changing and moving and what applies and what doesn't apply. And so, Monday I'll be on a different webinar and I'll hear different things. So it's evolving, and honestly, I try to stay focused on what I have to do right now to take care of what we need to get done now. And we'll see. No. To answer your question, no, I have not.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Nancy. I appreciate it.
Anything else?
Oh, I'm sorry, I did have one more question. The last operating levy from 2011, how long was that in effect? Like, how long were people paying on that levy?
They're still paying on it. It's still on the books.
Okay.
But, I'm going to try to explain this. In 1976, they combined a bunch of old levies, and we have one effective millage rate for those levies. After that, there's 7 separate operating levies that were passed over the years that may have been passed at, let's say, 4.9 mils, and now are down to 2.1 mils. So with that reduction factor in place. So over time, all of those, we're still collecting on them, but not at the total amount we're supposed to be collecting on them over the years. I guess, I don't know how else to explain that, sorry. So they're still on the books because they're continuous levies. They'll be there forever. Well, unless they change something. But for right now, those are all listed down. The millage, the rates just happen to roll back to be able to collect that same dollar figure that we're supposed to be collecting.
Okay.
We mentioned dates. We do have time, but those dates that we just showed on the screen will get here sooner than we think. So.
Well, thank you for the presentation. Very informative.
I would just like to, follow up with some of Mr. Clark's statements about the importance of people getting the facts. And that's so important. And I would encourage people who have questions to reach out to a district representative or a board member to educate themselves about how these things work. For example, we have something, to be board approved this evening that is being paid for out of PI funds and not the general fund. And, earlier this week, someone asked me about summer school and all of the services that go along with that. Well, it turns out that summer school is not paid for out of the general fund. It's currently being paid for out of ESSER funds. That ended up in a conversation about once those ESSER funds go away, we need to look at potentially trimming our summer school offerings. When you do that, we often talk about balance. When you talk about those kinds of services and supports. When you talk about the elementary level, you're talking about not closing the gaps, which is something we've been working really hard to do, and suddenly those gaps get larger without some of those summer school services. If you look at trimming at the secondary level, then you're looking at potentially impacting your graduation rate. Then people see your graduation rate goes down, and they want to and then they will question what is happening in that school district. The graduation rate has gone down in the last 3 years. So everything comes back full circle. We're having these conversations about cost-cutting measures, but everything comes with a cost. Mr. Clark referenced the buses, and yes, we have reduced the number of buses that we purchase each year. Eventually, that is going to catch up to us. He also referenced Mr. Perry identifying some opportunities to save money, out of our capital improvement fund. Well, again, but you don't want to have parking lots with potholes. You have to take care of your facilities, because then you're not being a good steward of taxpayer money either, because you're letting your facilities decline. So again, it's a tough balance. It's a hard balance. All of these conversations are difficult. We will continue to have those conversations and try to get creative and find ways to save money, but not do damage to educational programming and services and supports. But it's a big challenge. So, yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you, well put.